Morning and welcome to Facebook Live, Ask a Curator in their own words. Going to be talking about some D-Day oral histories today and how curators kind of use them in our sort of regular daily lives and all our little tasks. So I'm going to start by just quickly explaining what an oral history is. And an oral history is a recorded interview with someone who was there, a witness to the event. Could be a veteran, could be a home front worker, a child. In the context of World War II, it's anyone that saw or experienced an event that happened. The World War II Museum has got a large collection. We've actually have a dedicated department of traveling historians that goes around and collects these oral histories. And these people have been doing this for a very long time. And that has resulted in a pretty good collection of material that allow us to do some specific parts of our jobs as curators. So these oral histories are available on our websites. For researching from a curatorial standpoint, curators have a lot of different jobs, wear a lot of different hats around the museum. We write articles, work with the artifacts, temporary exhibits, we do speaking things, we do Facebook Live things. And oral histories play into a lot of these. What I'm going to talk about is interpreting artifacts and working with exhibits. And as an example, not at work, so don't have any artifacts on hand. Looking around the house for things to use. I can't use one of my cats, so we'll use this, something I have sitting around from a museum event a couple years ago. This is an M1 helmet, and I've got it painted up with the 7th Naval Beach Battalion. This is a unit specifically represented on D-Day. So I'm just going to pretend that this is an artifact that arrived at Josh's desk. How do I interpret this as a material? You know, in a perfect world, I'll get a name with it and hopefully a story, but that's why we're talking about this. In reality, I just have to look at this as a physical item, okay? I know it's a World War II, it's an M1 steel helmet. We could talk about front seams and rear seams and fixed bales and liners and all these little details that, you know, detail what this is or confirm its provenance, confirm its history. We can also look at what's physically represented on it. We can immediately say, hey, you know, the Navy painted blue around the rim of their helmets so that they could differentiate naval troops landing in Normandy against Army troops. The beach battalions painted this crescent with a number representing their units, the 5th, 6th, or the 7th are among some of them. So, but, you know, we have a helmet. And if I want to start looking into this helmet and write a label, for instance, for an artifact or maybe our D-Day gallery, if I just have the helmet and I start looking, okay, I know they painted this, I know it's the proper construction and fit and seam, and maybe I have someone's name. Other than that, all I can say is that the helmet was there. And looking into one of the many things that we use for researching stuff when it arrives are documents. You know, we'll look into after action reports. We'll look into the reports of the ships that drop people off. Most of this is written after the fact. Most of it's very mechanical in that it records how things happen, why things happen, when things happen, what the plan was, kind of what it turned into. But for the most part, especially in American operations, it talks about the success of them. In all of that, you lose the personal story, which is a huge element of what we do at the museum and really what is essentially history, which is storytelling. So we can back up all this material, and I can tell you all about this thing with facts, and I can say it was here, it was probably here, it did this on the beach, but no one really tells you about the guy whose head was underneath this helmet during the invasion. And that's where oral histories are really important to us, something that we really like to use as an element of storytelling. So I'm going to play a few clips for you, two specifically from our D-Day collection. We've got a fairly extensive number of oral histories that relate to D-Day. It's sort of the founding of our museum with Stephen Ambrose and very on. We were the D-Day Museum before we were the National World War II Museum. And we're going to look at two. We're going to look at Elmo Bell and George Morgan, both of which are available on our digital content website. The important thing to think about when we play these videos, and we'll start talking about Elmo Bell. Elmo is a paratrooper that drops into Normandy on D-Day, night of, morning before. And a lot of is known about the drop. We talk about the missed drops, the scattering, you know, there's all of this that comes through. A lot of this is reflected in post-war histories. We talk about the C-47s when they make that turn over the peninsula, hit a cloud bank and flak, neither of which they were expecting or, you know, were ready to deal with or were able to deal with, but we're still scattered anyway. You've got planes going up, planes going down. But ultimately, if you read the after action reports, you know, they talk about the problems, the issues, but when it boils down to it, it tells you that, okay, this many planes made it through, this many planes went down, this many paratroopers were dropped, yes, they were scattered. Well, the only way to get further information about what it was like in that plane is really mostly with the planes that went down. You'll find a missing aircrew report that will detail tail number of the aircraft, maybe witnesses from other aircraft that saw the incident. And that's how we kind of chase things down. But in the case of Elmo Bell, we have an oral history of the man that was actually in the aircraft. And that really helps us understand the moment, understand the emotion of what he's going through. And it answers the question, which you would probably get a lot when you're saying the paratroopers dropped in Normandy. It's like, well, what was it like in the plane? How did you get out of it? So I am going to take my technology here. I'm going to mute myself, and then I'm going to play a video, and I'll be back with y'all in just a minute.
We approached Normandy. The jumpmaster was watching the door, and as soon as he could see landfall, he ordered the troops to stand up and hook up. And while we were in the process of doing that, the plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Of course, there was a mad scramble to try to get to the door and get out of the crippled plane. But the plane was listing to the right. I was number 2 man in the stick, and I was able to get to the door first. And I crawled to the door, intending just to crawl on out, but when I got to the door, we were down at treetop level, much too low to drop. Then Sergeant Zeitner was the jumpmaster, and he was back in the tail of the plane. He crawled up, and the two of us stood together in the door and locked arms to hold the others back. And everyone had one thought in mind, was to get out of that crippled plane. The first sergeant leaned over and shouted in my ear, telling me to watch the ground and to tell him if we gained enough altitude to drop. After a while, I could tell that we were gaining altitude. And I thought we were still low to jump, but I wanted to let the jump master know at least that we were gaining altitude. And I leaned over to tell him that, and when I called his name, he jumped. Well, realizing that I had triggered his premature jump, I went out too. And going out the door, I realized that the rest of the stick was going to follow me. So I had just compounded a small problem. But anyway, we landed safely. We rolled up the stick. We were ready to go in a matter of minutes. And even more remarkable, we were on the drop zone. And I don't know how that was managed, because the planes were flying in tight formation, and he couldn't break formation. Now, granted, when the plane was hit, we were still out at sea. We could just see landfall. So there was some 20 or 22 miles between there and the place we dropped. And what kind of maneuvers he made between the time that the plane was hit and the time we dropped, I have no idea. But it worked out extremely well.
All right, well, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed Elmo talking about what happened to him on his particular C-47. And this is one of those moments where it's great to tell, if I'm going to interpret the story of a paratrooper drop or his story specifically. This clip of oral history is a great example of the strengths and weaknesses of oral history. He's not saying that they're bad in any way. It's just when we do historic research, we have to piece all these different sources together to create a complete story. In oral history, since it's a point of view, it's just a specific, that person's thoughts, emotions, and feelings. From the window of his, or from the jump door of the C-47, Elmo doesn't know that there's a cloud bank that's broken up the formation. Elmo doesn't, well, he knows that there's anti-aircraft fire coming in, but he doesn't know how it's affected everything. All he's living in is his moment right there when he climbs up to the window, peers over, and sees the tops of trees. Not a good thing, but that's his experience. And so we can compare his story in the context of the overall drop that we know through documentations, through previously published works, and we can add a personal element to that paratrooper drop. I mean, the rest of his story really begins once he hits the ground, but the fact that he was able to make it out of a crippled aircraft that returned back, but ultimately is recorded as a successful drop, take his version of it, it was successful in that they hit the ground. It was pretty rough as far as the actual experience. And if you think about going into combat for the first time, your intro before you've even landed in occupied France is to get tossed around in an aircraft that you suspect may be going down and you want to get out and it's too low for even your parachute to open. It really helps you put yourself into the mindset of what was going on there. The next one here, we're gonna do a little bit of clicking. I'm going to talk about a man named George Morgan. Now, George Morgan has got a really impactful oral history, and I think it's one of the best ones as far as telling us the real emotion of what's going on in the moment. George Morgan is a member of the UDT. He's part of our beach battalions, represented by our crescents on our helmets and everything. And George's job was to go into the beach and clear obstacles from the surf back. There were combined combat demolition teams that went into Normandy, blowing beach obstacles to create gaps so that follow-up landing craft can land without touching off mines, hitting obstacles, getting turned, flipped, all the above. George Morgan is part of a crew that's dealing with all that. Now, if you look at the mission, we look at the after-action reports for these type of units. They say they had a lot of trouble. They did detail a lot of the casualties. If you read the print, you can tell that it was a pretty rough engagement for these guys. But ultimately, we took the beach. Gaps were eventually cleared. The mission was successful. So, but we get a different view and a really different feeling when we listen to George Morgan give it in his own words. So I'm going to go back on mute here and let you all hear about George.
It was awful. The noise was terrible. I can equate it to a thunderstorm and a crack of lightning cracks right above your house. And the crack and then the thunder. And that's what it's like continuously, hour after hour after hour. What happened at Omaha, that was a real snafu. And over there was NCDU, Naval Combat Demolition Units. These 5-man teams were to take care of the obstacles that were on the beach. A lot of the GIs were hiding behind this stuff that we were supposed to blow up. So even if we had our explosives, we couldn't blow it up because these guys were hiding there. They didn't want to go any further because of what was happening. I didn't know whether I was going to see the sunset that day. I was so scared. I pissed my pants. And I was, what in the world am I doing here? It just, you can't get away from it. It's just terrible.
So that's definitely one of the most impactful clips I've seen from our collection about George talking about what it was like on the beach. And it's another thing that's a really important element to talk about. You know, we'll go back to our little helmet here. When we're just trying to tell you about this thing, we can't tell you what it smelled like. You know, we don't know what it sounded like. You don't know the feelings and the emotions and the thoughts and the fears. There's no amount of textual and archival research that can tell you what those things are like. And that's why we really find that these oral histories are very important, is that they give us that element of that story. And it helps us tell things in a more compelling and true way, down to the mission of the World War II Museum, which is to tell the story of the individual soldier. And telling that story doesn't get much more personal than have them say it in their own words. So I think we're going to open up to a few questions about oral histories, about how curators use them, about D-Day in general, if you want to. I think first up, we have what comprises a stick. Stick is essentially a slang term for a group of men that are in a single C-47 that drops. So that's one group of paratroopers, 12 to 18 per stick, and it all varies. It's usually one organizational unit, you know, a squad, about depending on their gear, and then they'll also have equipment slung underneath the aircraft in bundles and sacks as well. So Elmo would have been a part of a stick. His stick would have been assigned a specific number and then a specific aircraft. So it's a really famous photo of Eisenhower talking to a paratrooper, you know, doing a little fishing thing. They were talking about fishing. His name was Wally Strobel. He's got a 23 on his chest, and that indicates his aircraft number and basically his stick number as well. And looking on next, slow on technology for my part. So what is my favorite oral history in the D-Day related collection? We have a lot of D-Day related material. It's on our digital website, which we can post a link on here. We're able to digitize a couple hundred, well, actually a couple thousand eventually is the goal. My favorite D-Day related one is actually a man named Walter Halloran. It's an area that I've been looking into recently, something that I have coming up in the future about combat photographers. And Halloran was a combat photographer that landed with the 163rd Signal Photographic Unit. And he actually took some of the more iconic film footage to actually survive Omaha Beach. Some of it is a clip where you see a number of men, 4 men walking up in the surf, and you see one go down from machine gun fire. Well, that was Walter Halloran, morning of D-Day, filming from the shingle looking back towards the surf. So it's an oral history that means a lot to me right now, and it's really, really fascinating because this guy lands on a hot beach, and all he has is a camera, and he's there trying to keep himself alive but also record the moment, which is another element of items that really help us tell the story. And wait for the next one. Sorry, y'all, going a little slow at this moment. Our next question is, how wide did the Airborne spread their drops? It's hard to put an actual geographic blip on it other than to say all the way across Normandy. Some missed as much as 10 miles. Some missed, some landed right on them. The majority were hovering kind of near their drop zones, but what you have to understand is that paratroopers, it's very important to roll up the stick. So all the men on the aircraft, all their combat power rests as a group. Well, if they get spread out and they can't roll themselves up into a group, they're light infantry to begin with. So even a slight misdrop where some men from the same aircraft land across fields is a big issue. Most of them were just kind of spread out everywhere. But in confusion, they were able to get a lot of work done. Coming up next. What are the blimps on the beach? Blimps are always fun. So they're called barrage balloons. This is a technology that pretty much first time someone tried to shoot at someone with an aircraft, they were trying to figure out how to stop that from happening. So it dates back First World War, used fairly extensively in the Second World War. You take a balloon and you attach a very heavy cable to it, and then you float that balloon up where aircraft might fly through to try and strafe you. So if that aircraft strikes that cable, more than likely it's going to damage that aircraft and probably even bring it down. So each balloon was attached to various landing crafts to just sort of make it difficult to get nearby. There were also other operations that were involved on D-Day where you take a balloon and put it very close to the hull of a small craft like a PT boat or an LCS, and it increases the radar signature of that vessel. So the Germans think there's a bigger boat sitting out there, and they actually sent a couple of boats off the Pas de Calais, things like that, to make the Germans think on radar that there was a large fleet where there was actually just a couple small boats. Let's see, are there D-Day vessels that survive today besides the Texas? There are a couple in England. There is the Laffey out in Charleston is also a D-Day vessel. Laffey actually has pretty close history with the Texas. And then number 2 small landing craft out in Europe. There aren't as many. Most of these vessels were sent to the Pacific afterwards, or like the Texas were retired and turned into razor blades eventually, or museum ships, things of that nature. Good question about after action reports. How quickly were after action reports taken in general, done? It depends on, so the thing with after action reports is that they're viewed through the lens of the commanding officer or the highest surviving officer of a vessel or commanding officer of infantry units. In an ideal world, they're filled out as quickly as possible so that everything is still fresh. You can still take account of everything. But in the case of a lot of these battles, a lot of these really big moments, it can be a couple of days or a couple of weeks before someone gets a proper after action report submitted. And I know in the case of the Navy, if they write it a couple of weeks after, they'll take their logbooks and they'll talk them over, take notes in the moment. But it's usually not just landed troops, go sit down at the typewriter and start cranking out the action report. So it is a little bit of hindsight, but it's pretty close to the moment, and they're very good about interviewing people that were around. But like I said, it's usually through the viewpoint of the officers, and it's also very much geared towards learning from the experience, not so much recording the personal story. They want to know what worked, why it worked, and how well it worked, or what didn't work, and what they broke. That's a big thing. Troop carriers and gliders. Overlooked and overloaded are a couple of the questions that are kind of coming through here. It's always been the shortcoming of any major assault for troops to always bring more than they need. Everyone always wants to stick that extra pack of cigarettes in, that extra hand grenade. In general, everyone was very overloaded. It's a major assault. You don't want to go to Europe and not have everything that you need. Gliders too, you're packing a lot into a wooden glider anyway. So they were trying to weigh everyone out. They were trying to set their balance loads and everything, but a lot of this stuff did have a fair amount of equipment on it. Now, grossly overloaded, they all would have made the landings if there was no opposition. So we're talking about asparagus in the fields, hedgerows that are not the size that they were expecting. Things of that nature is what really broke up those landings. Overlooked, I think paratroopers seem to hear a fair amount of attention for everything that they did. I do think that the glider riders, the guys coming down in gliders, definitely need a higher point in prominence in history and storytelling. And that's a couple of things that we do have in our collection as well that kind of help tell those stories. Let's see, what else we got here? Pathfinders, what was the difference between Pathfinders securing their landing zones until the drop zones can be coming in? They made it a little over an hour ahead of time. They were on the ground, supposed to be setting up their equipment, but they kind of suffered a lot of the same problems as the full drop. Some of them were able to successfully complete their mission, some were not, some were scattered, some of their equipment was broken, landed in the wrong places, but they were the elite of the paratroopers, and whoever did land with their equipment on time and on target definitely did their job. I do have a question about LCIs. LCI is a landing craft infantry. They're technically called LCI-L, landing craft infantry large. These are something that I really, really enjoy talking about D-Day because they're kind of what I call a pivotal wave. LCIs carry between 150 and 200 troops. I mean, it's a full-size landing craft, and these will beach themselves and be able to disgorge an entire, basically, company's worth of men, which is a lot of combat power. However, they're vulnerable because all of those people are all in the same spot on the same vessel landing. The idea with the planning was that the first waves would have the beach secure and free of major fire by the time the LCI started coming in between the 9 and 11 o'clock hour, with the bulk of the reinforcements that would push off the beach. That ended up not being the case at Omaha specifically, where you get a lot of LCIs coming in, taking direct fire. And so a lot of very compelling, fascinating stories come from LCIs. Let's see. Walt Ehlers lands on an LCI. A number of different people land in LCIs that following up our primary assault waves. And I think we have enough time for about 2 more questions. Let's see. It's coming a little bit slow. Was Hitler sleeping when we landed in Normandy? It's, by all accounts, yes, he was. No one wanted to wake the Fuhrer. And other than not wanting to wake him kind of sleeping through it, the real issue was an overall command decision in that Hitler said that only he is allowed to release armored panzer reserves for action. So German field commanders aren't able to take advantage of material on hand. Whether Hitler's sleeping, having breakfast, or sitting in a meeting, they have to go all the way back to Berlin just to request to get units that they're basically looking at permission to get them to move. And then him sleeping on top of that, no one really wanting to wake him up for an hour or two, definitely complicates the matter. And I believe we've got our last question coming in. Was there a better window of time that Eisenhower could have taken? No, I mean, by all research and everything I've seen, that was it. You start to lose operational security at that point. You know, he had already kind of uncoiled the spring a little bit and then called it back with the weather delay. The Germans know that there's something going on. They would have gotten an indication that the operation had been launched and stopped. And the next decent tide table was almost a month in advance. So you would have kind of gotten all your gear on and gotten ready and then had to stop and then go. Obviously, we've got the advantage of looking back at the event, but it ended up being very much the right decision, and it was made based on pretty good information. So I think that's going to be it for our questions for now. I definitely want y'all to encourage y'all to look at a few things. Our online digital content website with oral histories, definitely go on there and search D-Day. It's the best way to get the search terms for a lot of these really great oral histories. You know, Len Lamel, you'll see George Morgan, you'll see Emma Bell on there. You're going to see all kinds of guys that have been interviewed in relation to the action in Normandy. Also want to mention that there's been a book written by the museum that is an excellent example of how we use these oral histories in one way. It's called Everything We Have. You can get it at the museum store. And it contains oral histories that are specific to the World War II Museum's collection. And this is a very prime example of how we use this material in telling of a story, weaving it in with artifacts, all of the above. And just make sure we're good. All right, well, thank you all for joining and listening to me talk and watch me hold up my helmet. And please come and check out our digital website for future oral histories and keeping the story going. Also, forgot to mention, we do have another website that talks about conducting oral histories. Now, given this day and age and this moment, do not go out and interview any World War II veterans. Don't do that right now. But you can take this time to check out our website, read about how to conduct an oral history, what the advantages are. You can even do some research and questions for when all of this is over, you're going to be able to go out and do that interview and make sure those stories stay going. So y'all have a great day, and we'll see you around again.